Picture a 20-something founder in Stockholm, flush with cash from his first company, the sports car, the nightclubs, champagne sprayed around a room like it means something. He's living the version of success everyone tells you to want. And he hates it. Years later, Daniel Ek would describe that period in one word: empty. Not humbled by it, not nostalgic for it, empty. So he did something almost nobody in his position does. He didn't tone it down. He walked away from the entire operating system of what a quote-unquote successful founder was supposed to look like. Now fast forward. Ek runs one of the most culturally influential companies on earth. The platform hundreds of millions of people open every day to feel something. And the man running it has built his whole life around refusing excess in any form. 3 or 4 meetings a day, that's the ceiling, no more. Every morning, rain or snow, he goes for a walk. Because that's where the real thinking happens, not in a boardroom. He doesn't do social calls. He's said so flatly. Personally reserved, professionally ruthless. A guy who tried on the loud version of success, found it made him feel like nothing, and built the quiet version instead. That reversal, the friction between who Ek used to perform and who he actually became, is the thread we will pull on for today's episode of Leaders. Episode 57 is Daniel Ek, the founder of Spotify. And as we allude to here, Daniel Ek is not your typical CEO. He's personally reserved but professionally ruthless. He goes on those long walks to sharpen his thinking. He looks to Beyonce for ideas on creativity. He refuses more than 3 meetings a day. The friction, the quiet guy running one of the world's most influential companies, is something we will describe and take on today. As far as the arc of this episode and where it will go, we will start inward of how he thinks, then go outward as to how he leads the company, and then finally how that then translates into a structural advantage of how Spotify actually runs their business. And then finally close on a philosophical close on trust and really playing the long game, because that's one of the threads of enduring leaders. They're building enduring companies. And with that, welcome back to Leaders, a podcast dedicated to exploring the best leaders this world has ever seen, and your number one source for actionable business leadership insights. Daniel Ek is certainly one of those leaders that comes top of mind. In the music entertainment industry especially, he has transformed that business and the way that way of the world works. And how does he do that? Let's start with how he thinks as first principles being a foundation for thinking, and one in which that he's formulated. So where does that come from for him? So Daniel Ek has explicitly tied it to not being embedded into the Silicon Valley ecosystem. He wasn't necessarily absorbing strategy by osmosis from the Google and Facebook style cultures that exist in Silicon Valley. Instead, he says he and other non-Valley founders had to work out first principles for themselves rather than copying the standard playbook. He's also said building a European company specifically forced this. Structures that work for an American company, many of the ones that we've covered in episodes on Leaders have been primarily American companies. For European ones, that doesn't necessarily work. So he had to go back to first principles to actually find what fit for that own situation, one that he built from Sweden. The mental model that he borrows from is pointing to Elon Musk's semantic tree framing, and that's the idea that you need to nail the fundamental principles, the trunk and the big branches of the tree, before getting lost into the details, which, or metaphorically speaking, could be the leaves, because without that foundation, the details have nothing to hang on to. So how does that show up in concrete decisions in Spotify. The first point would be podcast versus building a separate app. So when Spotify moved into podcasting, X reasoning wasn't podcasts are a different format, so build a dedicated product. Instead, he broke the problem down to what job was actually being done for users. And that job was discovery, ubiquity across devices, search, and realize those were shared infrastructure Spotify already had. So the different consumer experience, quote unquote, premise didn't really hold up in that situation. That let Spotify fold podcasts into the existing app rather than launching something incredibly new in that standpoint. He won that industry of podcasts by reframing the market. More broadly, the strategy write-ups on this era argue that he won by rejecting industry orthodoxy and recognizing that people don't experience audio content by format, music versus talk versus sports, but by context. And that's the same way that radio has always blended those together. The reframe is what has justified leveraging their existing 200 million plus user base instead of just trying to build podcast-specific distribution from scratch. There's also the long time horizon over quarterly optics mindset as well, and he's applied the same quote-unquote strip it down to fundamentals logic to company building itself, prioritizing user growth over near-term profitability early on the theory that a large engaged audience could be monetized later, and generally framing Spotify's evolution in decades rather than quarters. Leadership also as being a first principles rebuild, not an inheritance. So what do we mean by that? As Spotify scaled, he talked about having to rethink his own management approach, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. But he had to kind of rethink that from the ground up rather than defaulting to a control-based hierarchy, moving toward giving teams enough context to make some of the decisions and good calls by themselves, because in his own words, the leadership approach that got you here won't get you there. That's a common thread that we've seen throughout a lot of the leaders that we've studied here, is that a leadership style that works in the early days of the company may not be the best, and that leader has to adapt a different leadership style later on as the company matures and as the culture and what the company is doing evolves with it. In addition to that, there's creative models and inspirations that Daniel Ek is pulling on. 2 books and 2 people that really source inspiration for him are Leonardo da Vinci and Pablo Picasso. So with da Vinci, it's typically framed as the ultimate cross-disciplinary thinker. He fused art with anatomy, engineering, and observation, and that maps really onto Daniel Ek's own instinct to treat separate content categories, think music, podcasts, video, as shared infrastructure rather than siloed products. Example of that would be podcasts. They started with just a audio version of it, and more recently that has evolved into podcasts having a video feature to them, so embedding both of those mediums together. Picasso's arc is defined by restless reinvention, moving from the blue period through cubism to surrealism, never really settling into one mode, is a natural touchstone for a founder whose company pivoted from what they started as a pure kind of music streaming business, Napster equivalent, to podcast audiobooks, and now an AI-driven sort of audio platform. What else does Daniel lean on? He really thinks that the rate of learning is the best determinant of success, and he kind of quotes in saying, "I'm not an inventor, I just want to make things better." He also has a strong philosophy on creativity. Creativity requires structure, not freedom. Most people get that backwards. And he also says most creative people I know are almost scripted in their approach and process. He truly believes in the power of creativity, but he doesn't believe in the power of creativity without restraint. Most people associate creativity with unstructured thinking, but some of the most creative people he knows are almost scripted in their approach and process. He thinks of failure culture as a prerequisite for experimentation and says, unquote, "You can't have a culture of experimentation if you don't allow failures to happen." One of the motivational North Stars for Daniel Ek, too, is this idea that impact is ultimately the one thing that you should optimize for versus happiness. His philosophy on cultivating an environment where there's innovation, he says it's about a culture for allowing failures because you can't have a culture of experimentation if you don't allow failures to happen. That's how he fights complacency and encourages smart risk-taking. Risk-taking as it pertains to self-discovery as well, the leadership style that he exhibits is within that. I would say across a lot of the leaders that we've studied, he's a little different in that he is not your typical alpha male founder. He took time to really decode his own style and really have that show through in the company and how he talks about it in interviews and such. And so one thing that he really leans on as far as his style goes is the idea of an inverted pyramid mental model. Think of a Scandinavian Airlines CEO story. He's at the bottom, enabling everyone above him. And he says, really ultimately, that your leadership style is determined by your own perspective. Most leaders think of themselves at the top of a pyramid, and as a result, they employ a very natural top-down approach to it. He once heard that the CEO of a Scandinavian airline says that the right way to think about leadership is to actually flip that model. You should invert the pyramid and envision yourself as the guy at the bottom, X says. You are there to enable all the work being done. That's my mental image of what I'm here to do at Spotify. And this is not a new concept. This is one in which we've studied and shown in other leaders, predominantly within the demonstration, that they are at the kind of floor level. They are with the employees that are at the kind of lowest sort of totem pole ranking and hierarchy in their organizations, and they're spending a tremendous amount of time with that. They're also gathering a bunch of feedback from those people and having them help to drive some of these decisions, or how ultimately the CEO and the leader of the company is making some of these decisions is really based on a lot of this versus the information kind of funneling up and having that just be solely dictated by one person at the top. Contrast that maybe with what we see from a tentpole and one-to-one leaders model, and that's maybe more of what we've seen from Steve Jobs, in which he's demonstrated and we outlined in episode 2, and what made him really successful in a different way would be that he had not necessarily this very, collaborative decision-making approach. He dictated a lot of the vision and creativity and where Apple ended up going. He had that sole vision. He was really one of the only ones to kind of help drive that and make a lot of the key decisions along the way, versus this idea that Daniel has this collaborative decision-making, and this collaborative style ultimately has its good and bad and its trade-offs. And one of the things that he talks about is the ability to not really scale group meetings, or maybe in the past not being able to do that. He says, no, there's some leaders who prefer to have all executive decisions travel through them. But then you have to wait until the leader has availability to review all those things. It's kind of creating this natural bottleneck. Sometimes you run into delays in that process. I typically don't have more than really 3 or 4 meetings per day, so he's intentional about that. He's created this scaffolding that enables delegation and trust in the leadership. How do you think about building infrastructure so that you can actually say, hey, I'm just going to think about the long term, and I trust you folks to worry about the tactical pieces? I think you're entirely right. The part that I didn't mention, though, I spend most of my time on the long term. I devote most of my dedicated free time to be available on this ad hoc basis. He says ultimately from this, you have to make leadership personal. Candidly, His role that he says as a leader is to ultimately coach others on how to best make use of their limited time. He says not only is time the most precious resource the company has, it's also the most precious resource they have. It's crucial that they approach the use of their time with a holistic perspective. By way of example, he had a recent call with one of his directors who had not taken a vacation in 6 months. Our conversation delved into why this person thought that they could not be away for 2 weeks, and me arguing for why the person had to take 2 weeks to recharge. There's never enough time for work, for family, for friends, and it takes work to make the best use out of it. It's all about fostering this holistic perspective in life. One of the other things he leans on heavily is learning from other leaders as part of this. And the struggles that he's had from a meeting perspective, he's observed people like and shadowed a Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg we covered on episode 29. And he stole his Friday Q&A format from that. So one of the questions that Daniel was asked in an interview was, coming back to learning, he's learned that you shadowed and spent time with Zuckerberg and other founders. What have you learned from shadowing those other CEOs? And he says, it took me a lot of time to really decode and understand his leadership style, back to that last point. It's been fascinating to see some leaders lead one-to-one. They're the tentpole and everyone goes right to them for certain decisions. That's really not his style or how I do things, but it's a highly effective for some because, again, with a singular vision, you can accomplish great things. Leaders that fit that mold are very consistent and they can move very fast when making big decisions. Collaborative decision-making is the other end of the spectrum. He's seen some amazing companies operate that way, though I haven't been able to scale group meetings. Another person he's learned a lot from is Reed Hastings of Netflix. And in episode 17, we covered Reed. And one of the things that he learned from Reed was that pushing decisions down the organization and meeting executive team only on a once per month basis. Reed Hastings, he says, is on the other end of the spectrum. He learned a lot about his leadership style has been designed around pushing decisions down in the organization. He, for instance, doesn't meet his executive team very often. I don't know about these days, but he used to meet them only once a month. Few other people that he has drawn inspiration from are Toby Luque. He is the founder and CEO of Shopify. And Mike Cannon-Brookes, who is a founder at Atlassian, as reference points. He noticed that founders like himself and those two share a trait. None of them built their companies inside a traditional Silicon Valley environment, so none of them absorbed that kind of standard playbook by osmosis. His theory is that this outsider position forced all of them into a very first principles mode of company building, and he links that to a broader cultural pattern too, arguing the places where they reside, Canada, like Europe and Australia, tend to have more collective, holistic thinking versus American individualism. The two of them function less as creative inspirations, sort of, but more as peer proof points for a thesis about geography and culture shaping how you build a company, evidence that founders operating outside of the valley's kind of gravitational pull end up reasoning up from fundamentals rather than kind of sort of just defaulting to copying convention. A vivid confirmation of the relationship itself, Toby says he directly referenced something Daniel Ek had told him about him, suggesting the two talk about each other, or at least that Ek has spoken about Luque's mindset elsewhere. Toby's own philosophy, as he put it, is that a company lets you build the thing you think ought to exist and means test it against the market, a distinctly first principles framing that would resonate with what Eck described as his own approach. Probably in a future Leaders episode, we will cover more of Toby's thinking because he's got a lot of different ways that he's been successful in operating Shopify that have been really interesting and have far implications from studying his leadership style and what's led to success. Similar to, I would say, Daniel, but in some ways different that we will outline in a future episode. There's also a lighter, more social data point. So Daniel, Toby, and Mark Zuckerberg appeared together on a joint press club interview in 2021 discussing creator economy. The relationship isn't purely rhetorical. They're part of the same rough sort of pure circle of platform company CEOs, but they all kind of have different ways of operating. More on the operation from Daniel's side of things would be this Scandinavian flat management culture system versus a traditional founder CEO power concentration model. Daniel's approach isn't just an org chart. It's an attempt to encode a specific philosophy into a global technology company, and it's worth separating the two layers: the structure that everyone kind of talks about and the cultural assumptions underneath it that actually make it work, at least for him, or maybe don't in some cases. So the structure from Daniel's standpoint at Spotify, and maybe this is what he had initially built and maybe has since evolved then, but Spotify became famous in the kind of technology, IT, agile circles for a model built around small, autonomous teams. Squads, they're called, are cross-functional, long-lived teams of 6 to 10 people who own a specific problem space or a slice of the customer journey, typically owning product, design, engineering, data, and testing themselves. Squads are trusted to make their own technical decisions and manage their own work. Autonomy is the defining trait, with coordination emerging from shared culture and goals rather than top-down control. Related squads get grouped into tribes, kept under roughly 100 people so the organization stays legible, with regular informal gatherings so squads stay aware of what others are doing. Chapters and guilds sit on top of that as the connective tissue. Chapters group people with the same discipline across squads. Within a tribe, guilds link shared interests across the whole company, just as a kind of standard way of what that works. In addition, where the Swedish culture actually shows up more in Spotify and what Daniel has built, that gets attention, but he's really been explicit that the philosophy underneath it comes from his home. He's framed it as deliberately dashing the quote-unquote magical illusion of CEO power in favor of what he credits as a fundamental Scandinavian approach to authority and decision-making. A few Swedish management norms directly onto how they operate would be, one, a flat hierarchy and really emphasizing coaching over command. So Swedish organizations tend to run with few management layers, and managers see themselves as coaches rather than rule enforcers or dictating what people are doing. Subordinates are expected to solve problems rather than escalate them. That's the cultural DNA behind giving squads real decision-making authority instead of routing choices up a chain. In addition to that, the second one would be consensus before commitment. Consensus is central to how they make decisions. People expect to be consulted before something major gets finalized, and communication stays direct, calm, and low drama. That's a big part of why their model leans so hard on alignment before autonomy, rather than a founder simply issuing directives. There's some Swedish terms. The third point being here, lagom, which quote unquote is just the right amount. So lagom shows up in Swedish companies as a preference for flat hierarchies, steady rather than high stakes growth, and decisions that are carefully weighed rather than rushed. Same instinct behind Daniel and capping his own meetings and pacing his company's expansion deliberately rather than chasing really high, aggressive, explosive growth and blitz scaling for its own sake. The fourth one here would be Jantelagen, and that's discomfort with hierarchy and self-importance. The law of Janti helps explain a cultural discomfort with visible status, boasting, or overt hierarchy. That's a plausible thread back to his own personal reserve. The quiet guy isn't just a personality quirk, it's actually somewhat culturally normative. So, in summary, with like those foundational frameworks of his management approach and leadership style, to kind of sum that up, the squad model that we had initially introduced maybe was never as clean in practice as a white paper that was written on it made it look, but they've quietly sort of moved past that and evolved past that sort of model by 2020. And of course, many companies and leaders had to reset or rethink about the way moving forward as to what leadership looked like and what did their company look like as a result of COVID and its impacts. But Spotify had moved on from a fixed Spotify model and the strict separation between chapters and squads, which created chronic ambiguity over who was actually accountable when something failed. A former Spotify PM who joined during a period of rapid growth was warned before he even started that the model was more aspirational than reality. Company had tripled to 3,000 people in 18 months, and the famed squad structure showed cracks under that scale. Even the person most associated with the model, Henrik Nieberg, has said that it was never meant to be copied, just an example of how one company works. So maybe just a framework that Daniel ended up building on and evolving from. In addition to that management approach, let's go into more of how he actually operates day to day. So one of the things that he emphasizes within this, right, is asynchronous thinking over meetings and loving one-on-one conversations and disliking the larger bureaucratic formal meetings. Again, a max of 3 to 4 meetings per day. Ad hoc availability kind of fills the rest of his day. He had one weekly meeting with all 14 SVPs, and that was what he described as a single forcing function for alignment. Most notably, and more recently, Daniel has transitioned out of the CEO role and now has a co-CEO structure where Alex owns the business and content and Gustav owns the product and technology. And Daniel sort of synchronizes that through the entire company. So that's a newer model that Spotify has adopted of more recent. An interesting one to say the least, because ultimately, from a co-CEO standpoint, it's not very common. And so we'll see how Daniel's vision and some of the principles that he's adopted as a leader, do those continue to shine through in this new model where he's not in the CEO seat. In addition to that, we've talked about this before, but time as the most precious resource in the company, coaching his team on that, including pushing a director to take those vacations and those sort of things to recharge and really optimize. He ultimately says that he is a better coach than a player, and so maybe in this new role, he's more in the coaching mindset and synchronizing again across the company. He personally feels strongly about a few different things. One being of which that the founder needs to be a product person. He definitely was in that seat and had adopted trust to build consistency over time. He evolved from being a very hands-on product-led founder at the beginning to more of a context setter of what he describes today. He views his most important functions more as being a generalist, an editor of the vision, and providing constraints for the organization, and then really kind of honing in and communicating back to what is the purpose of the company, what is the purpose of the people working there, and how does that align with the mission of the company. The biggest thing as he scales up that he reminds people of is, as you get a larger company, to not get complacent, and that's really important. Do the right thing and always raise the bar. And in this kind of evolving role, ultimately he chose, there's going to be this concept of star versus constellation, and he ultimately chose a very kind of star approach over the constellation framework, and we'll go more into that. But so Daniel, over time as a founder, started at the company really with building it. And then as he built it, he really got hands-on. He got that product mindset. He then became a context setter and then ultimately the editor of the vision of the company. So that's not really a sort of logical and tidy arc of a leader of the company to go through. He's described his own career as being almost exactly those terms. He announced his move to executive chairman effective January of 26, and he wrote that he's always thought of roles as missions rather than titles, and that he's held roughly 9 different missions under the same job title, assembling furniture and negotiating the company's first deals in the early days, then running finance, then product, then sales and marketing. That's a founder who was at various points literally the guy doing IKEA assembly in the office. The quote-unquote editor of the vision phase that he's in now is happening. Gustav Soderstrom and Alex Nordstrom, who are both 15-plus year Spotify veterans, became those co-CEOs on January 1st, reporting to him while he stepped back to focus on the long arc of the company. That long arc of the company is really what he describes as he's a generalist at the top, setting constraints and pulling the organization back to its purpose and mission. His whole career has shown this pattern of treating constraints as strategic tools rather than obstacles. Early on, an example being that Spotify couldn't get US licensing and was forced to launch only in Sweden and the UK. He basically said flatly that Spotify would likely not have survived if it had launched in the US first, because that forced narrowness let the team reach saturation in small markets and prove the model to skeptical labels before scaling. That's the same instinct now operating at the org level. Instead of trying to be hands-on everywhere, he narrows what the company optimizes for and lets the specialist execute. In addition, he again describes himself as a better coach than a player now. That's the strongest, most literal line he could use. It's his own phrase. He explains the executive chairman move to Reuters in an article, and he says, I will be more involved than a typical U.S. chairman, so think of it more, a little bit like moving from a player to coach. You don't need to construct the metaphor for the episode. He kind of handed it to us there. The value of a company is the sum of the problems you solve. That line does real work as the connective tissue for this, as the operating principle that justified that transition. If value comes from the breadth of problems solved rather than one product executed perfectly, then the highest leverage move for the person at the top eventually stops being to solve more problems personally and starts being widening the aperture of what the organization ultimately solves. So it's the Constellation strategy has a very specific document cast and audiobooks directly into the main app rather than shipping separate apps. He described as the industry standard approach. Separate apps for separate content types, the way Meta runs Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger as all distinct products. That's kind of what he frames as the Constellation strategy, casting a lot of different nets and deliberately then rejecting it in his mind. His bet was actually the opposite. One centralized dominant hub with users listening context, not content formats, determining what lives inside it. That's the same way that radio has always blended talk, music, and sports into a single stream rather than requiring separate devices. He's described their growth, too, as not as one smooth curve, but as many different linear S-curves stacked on top of each other. Sequential sort of bets from going from music into podcast, into audiobooks, and now into video, layered on top of a center star standpoint. So he builds that one dense sort of unified star portfolio, and the ecosystem lives inside that single star as an expanding set of sort of formats, not as separate hero products competing for different audiences or attention. Definitely more of a contrarian story if you frame it like that, of something that is maybe not as obvious to the people kind of regularly consuming Spotify and such, but one in which that he was intentional about how that was built. And so ultimately for Daniel, in terms of his legacy and what his leadership reflects, he wants to be known for trust, consistency, and the long game. So trust he builds through consistency over time. Say what you'll do and then you'll do it. De-risking deals for the record industry was a short-term pain that he endured for a very long-term gain. Fighting complacency in a large company is something he's had to deal with recently. And so continuing to emphasize raising the bar, doing the right thing, and really the speed of the iteration beats any sort of quality of iteration. And at the end of the day, for him, it's all about trust. So to close here, Daniel Ek, I think, is a case study in self-aware leadership, knowing what you're not as much as what you are. He's a very reserved Swede who built one of the loudest companies in the world, arguably, by getting out of the way and ultimately doing things his way and adopting a very unconventional management approach where he is dictating it from bottom down and not top down. And with that, that is episode 57 on Daniel Ek, and we'll be back with episode 58 soon. Thanks for listening.